Hello and welcome to 8-3. Today we're going to talk about relationships between angles. I thought this was a pretty funny little joke. I recommend you pause the video and I would write down this little tip that it's giving you right here on how to remember the difference between complementary and supplementary angles. Anyways, that's kind of our big deal today. We're talking about the relationships between different angles and how can we find the angles if we don't know or don't have a protractor to measure them. And I think this stuff is so fun, so I'm excited to share it with you today. All right, so first let's talk about congruent angles. Now this is something that you need to write into your notes. All of these are really good things to get in there because it'll give you the definitions. You're going to need the definitions to write proofs. It's just very important. So congruent angles are the same as congruent shapes. They have exactly the same measure. Okay, so if I was looking at this figure below, I could say angle M. Ooh, I need a dot in the middle. I didn't put a dot in the middle. Angle MRP is congruent to angle NRQ. They are exactly the same measure, okay? And notice how when I write my angles down, I start on the outside, go into the middle, and then go back out to the outside. That is something that we need to start practicing when we're writing the angles. So that's pretty easy. Just any angle that has the same measure, we'd call them congruent. Then we have a thing called vertical angles. Now, vertical angles, you guys, I did this in high school where I had to talk about vertical angles to prove why something was the measure that it was. So this is something you need to really store in a special spot in your brain so it can come back out. Every year you're going to be talking about this stuff. So vertical angles are formed opposite each other when two lines intersect. Any two lines intersect. The opposite angles. So in this case we have 20. Angle NRQ is a vertical angle with MRP. They're both 20. They're congruent and they're opposite of each other. Then we also have angle MRN is vertical angle to PRQ because we have these opposite angles 160 and 160. We know if we have two lines that intersect, we know that vertical angles 1 and 2 are going to be congruent. We would know that vertical angles 3 and 4 would also be congruent with each other. So 3 and 4 are congruent and 1 and 2 are congruent. So 4 and 2 are not congruent. 1 and 3 are not congruent. And if we remember, congruent means the same measure. They're the same. So I would draw this diagram in your notes. I would write this right here so you have the reference saying angle MRP and NRQ are vertical angles because they're opposite of each other. Now again, like everything, the more we practice, the easier this will be, the more ingrained in your brain it will be. So let's keep going on. Okay, then we have something called adjacent angles. As you see, this chapter so far has just been defining a lot of things and adding new vocabulary into our repertoire. So adjacent angles, just like adjacent sides, they're just two angles that are next to each other. So our 20 degree and our 160 degree, those two are adjacent. Our 160 degree and this 20 degree, adjacent. They share a common vertex and a ray. So these two share a common vertex, which is where 2 points meet, and they share a ray. Okay, so that would be what are adjacent angles. So again, angle MRN, this was R, I forgot to write that in there. MRN, so we're talking about the 160 here, MRN. And NRQ are adjacent angles because they're right next to each other. They share vertex R and ray RN. Okay, So just, again, please pause the video and read through this slowly and say, does this make sense? But it's just like when we talked about adjacent sides. Well, this is just saying they're two angles that are next to each other, that's all. They share a ray and a common vertex or a point. Okay, so now we get into a problem here. Identify the type of each angle pair shown. So when we have opposite angles, those are called vertical angles. Again, I know that because they are opposite of each other. Now, if I have two angles that are next to each other, those are called adjacent. A-D-J A-C-E-N-T, adjacent angles, because they are two angles that are right next to each other. They share the vertex here, and they share this ray here. That's why I know they are adjacent angles. Okay, now let's add some more vocabulary words. You guys, this should be a lot of notes into your notebook. Okay, so here we're going to talk about complementary angles. So we gave that little tip at the beginning. Here's how I like to remember. Complementary starts with CO, and I can kind of make, if I draw a line here, it equals a 90. CO, 90. Let me do it again. CO. If I draw a line, it makes a 90. So I know that complementary angles are two angles whose measure is 90 degrees. So any two angles, if they add up to 90 degrees, they're complementary. For example, I have this one that has a 25-degree angle here and a 65-degree angle. And if I added 25 degrees and 65 degrees, I would get 90 degrees. They're complementary, two angles that add up to 90 degrees. Okay, so again, I remember it because it starts with CO. If I draw my line, CO makes a 90. Okay, now watch for supplementary here. So supplementary, S-U, okay, ready? So supplementary is 180. So ready? If I put a 1, let me do it in a different color here. If I do a 180, you see it? 180, S-U-P, S-U, we can make it into a 180, 180 degrees. So supplementary are two angles whose measures have a sum of 180 degrees. We remember 180 degrees is just a straight line. So they're two angles that add up to a straight line. If I add up my 65 and my 115, I would get it to be 180 degrees. Okay, so I will tell you, you will need to know what does supplementary mean, what does complementary mean on your test. And now this is the beginning chapters. So this is something you're going to need to write down in your notes. I'd put arrows towards it so I remember to write it on my note card for my test. This is very important. We know the definition of complementary, supplementary, vertical angles, congruent angles, adjacent angles. They're all going to be on the final test, so make sure you put little arrows. You're going to need to define planes, points, rays, line segments, lines. There's a lot of definitions in this. That's why it's very important we take very detailed notes to help ourselves out later. All right, let's keep going. All right, so now here we're going to get to some problems and see exactly what you'll see on your assignment tomorrow. So for each problem you do, I want you to write vertical angles. I want you to write supplementary. I want you to write complementary. So this first one happens to be complementary. Complementary angles here. And I know complementary angles add up to 90 degrees. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say 55 degrees plus this bit plus A is going to add up to 90 degrees. Now we're going to solve it like we solve these types of equations. I'm going to subtract 55, and I would get 0 here. So A is going to equal 35 degrees. Put a box around it. Now I kind of got big here. I'm going to have to get a little bit smaller for this next one. So our next one here is two angles that add up to 180 degrees. That would be supplementary angles. And I know, again, supplementary, 180 degrees. So for this, I'm going to say 75 plus b is going to equal 180. So then I would subtract 75, and I would get b equals 105 degrees. Okay, and then lastly, I see we have some vertical angles going on here. Two intersecting lines that are the opposite angles. And so I know that vertical angles are congruent. So the measure of angle C is going to be 51 degrees. I don't really need to do any work for that because it's just the same thing. It's just congruent with its opposite angle. So that is all for those ones. We have one more problem I want to touch on here quick. Okay, so we have multiple angles here. We don't just have two. So a piece of information we need to know is that angles JGF, and KGH. Okay, so angle D and angle E are congruent. Oh, well, hey, that adds up. Okay, so I'm going to use supplementary angles because I see we have a straight line FH. Okay, so I know that angle D plus 136 degrees plus angle E is going to equal 180 degrees. Okay, so first let's get rid of our 136 from both sides. Minus 136, that'd be 0. Okay, 180 minus 136 would be 44 degrees, and that's going to be D plus E. And I know D and E are going to be the same exact number. So I'm saying, okay, what's 44 divided by 2? And I know that 44 divided by 2 is 22. So D equals 22 degrees and E equals 22 degrees. Because I knew they were the same, they had to add up to 180 because we have a straight line, which is supplementary angles. Oh, I didn't draw that out for you. Supplementary, and that would be 180 degrees. All right, well, that is all that I have for you today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. Make sure you bring your notes to school.